Greetings, everybody. I want to do a video here now asking the question that James Cook has just asked on BBC regarding the SNP leadership race that is now underway. Will faith turn the tide for Scottish independence? There it is on the BBC website just today, actually yesterday, 13 hours ago. And it's featuring it's showcasing the two leading candidates to replace Nicola Sturgeon. Now, I'm conscious that there's a UK audience here and probably a non-UK audience. Let me just give you a very, very rapid whistle-stop tour of what's gone on in politics in the last few weeks, in fact, last few days. Just before Christmas, there was a very controversial, it was controversial by the atheistic secular standards of the world, let alone the church, controversial plan to reduce the age that a child, in effect, could autonomously self-identify as a member of the opposite sex. So it's called the Gender Reform Recognition Reform Act, and it was put through Parliament, legislation and so on was put through successfully just before Christmas, and then it was subsequently blocked by the UK government in England, so at Westminster in London, and that then was something that Nicola Sturgeon wanted to use as fuel to bring Scotland out of the UK, and that then inadvertently caused inertia to that, and I think that's why she's basically resigned. A shock resignation just this week, or last week, I think it was, very recently. So it's this shock, and this is now the replacement. And these are the two candidates, and they're both religious people, and that's why this has caught my attention. Will faith turn the tide for Scottish independence? So I'd encourage you to read it, but let me go through a bit of it now and just give you some thoughts as briefly as I can. So first of all, James meets with Kate. They both interviewed yesterday. They were on TV and so on. I'm sure that people in the UK saw that. James, the editor, he asks, "What did we learn?" And he goes on to say that Kate Forbes told me that she would not have backed the Scottish Government's controversial bill. That's the bill I was telling you about, the Gender Recognition Reform Act bill. And so she's saying that because she was on maternity leave, she didn't have to vote anyway, so we won't know whether or not she would have actually resigned over the issue. But if she had voted against it, she'd have had to resign, so we'll just have to take her word for it. Forbes, this is the conservative Christian, she's a member of the Free Church. "I would not have been able to vote for the principle of self-ID," she said. Her fellow contender, so another lady called Ash Regan, they haven't interviewed her yet, but did vote against that and did resign. Okay, so this issue of conscience that Kate Forbes brought up yesterday in her TV interview, she was talking about the importance of conscience and being able to, and I've written a whole chapter on this in a new book, which is why it piqued my interest. Kate was claiming that you should be able to, of course, vote on a conscience level without there being repercussions, which is true. But my point in response to Kate would be, Kate, if you're going to vote about a Gender Recognition Reform Act, why aren't you voting against other things? Why aren't you voting against marriage? Maybe you needed to have said something about the overall situation with how do you match your free church theology, biblical theology, with any involvement. I'm not saying you can't be a member of the parliament, a politician if you're a Christian, but I don't know how you hold in tension the policies and the behaviour of the SNP with biblical faith. This is what I mean. Look at what she says. The editor goes on to say, at the heart of Miss Forbes' identity is her membership of the socially conservative... I don't know why she's called Miss Forbes. Anyway, she's part of the Free Church of Scotland. She told me that a significant glare of scrutiny on her in this regard was fair enough. I'm glad that she thinks that. She added, I think we get into very dangerous territory when we say that certain public offices are barred to certain minority groups. I think there's a naivety there that's quite hard to understand. How Miss Forbes expects there to be not only scrutiny, but even an ability, for it to even be possible to hold sound orthodox biblical theology in tension with the values of the SNP as a whole, or even of secular politics. I don't know how people do it. I mean, I'm imagining there's some very good people in the background who are who are standing up for truth and in prayer and intercession. So I'm sure that goes on. But in terms of the front benches, so to speak, how does this? Miss Forbes is a senior member of the government anyway. She's a finance secretary. She'd been, in cahoots with Sturgeon for the last however many 3 years or whatever it is. How do you keep in tension your biblical faith, which only becomes a conscience issue on certain things? You can't pick and choose that. Forbes says, I'm just here. I'm talking to you as somebody who has a Christian faith. I've never kept that a secret, which is good. But I would like to ask, in the last 6 years, when have I ever imposed that on other people? That's not a virtue. She's saying that as though it was a virtue. She has a subjective understanding of what conscience would mean in terms of her own subjective conscience. So she would have voted against the Gender Recognition Reform Act, but she's not kicking up a fuss about other things that she should be if her conscience was objectively the conscience conscription, as I call it, of the Holy Spirit. Again, I've got a whole chapter on that in a new book if you're interested. The conscription of conscience of the Holy Spirit. It's not the conscription of conscience of Kate Forbes. It's not the conscription of conscience of the Free Church. It's the conscience of conscription of God. And that's the point. You don't pick and choose that. So then it comes to this other guy, Mr. Yusuf. He's a Muslim. Apparently he's a very proud Muslim who's fasting in Ramadan, but he's still voting in favour of children being able to change their gender, or homosexuality, or marriage redefined. Well, I don't think that's consistent with Islam, is it? I don't think my legit Muslim neighbour is going to agree with that, Mr. Yusuf. So, with respect, stop talking about your Muslim faith if you're not going to take it seriously. Nominalism. I asked him why he thought there had been more focus on Christianity than Islam. That's a very good question. He said, "I don't legislate on the basis of my faith," he replied, adding that he had a track record of supporting gender reform, gay marriage, and buffer zones around abortion clinics. So Mr. Yusuf is claiming to be a legit Muslim, fasting on Ramadan, but he's legislating for gender reform, gay marriage, and buffer zones around abortion clinics. Does this sound like faith to you? To answer James's question in this article, is faith going to change the tide of Scott? It's not faith. This isn't faith. This is the Pharisees in the time of Jesus. This is the instituted religious landscape that is synonymous with whitewashed tombs, hypocrisy, powerlessness, the demonic. Miss Forbes retorted, if I may, insisted that she did not legislate on the basis of her faith either, favouring votes of conscience on some social issues where an individual can put aside party allegiance to cast a ballot on the basis of their morals without political repercussions. This is an oddity to me. This is me speaking, sorry. Mrs. Forbes, Kate Forbes is trying to insist that she doesn't legislate on the basis of her faith either, which is oddly contradictory to what she's just said about the Gender Reform Recognition Reform Act legislation. But then she's saying here that she should somehow be able to go against the party if her conscience tells her. Again, it's conscience, what I've said. I don't need to repeat that. Forbes gave the example of gay marriage as well. As a Christian, she explained, she believed marriage to be between a man and a woman, but she insisted she would defend the law as a servant of democracy. What does that mean? There's a bizarre contradictory tone in all of this, and I hope you can see that. I hope the Free Church can see that, if anyone from the Free Church happens to watch this. So both leading candidates are people of faith. No, they're not. but both insist they're Democrats too. I would argue that they're neither. To be a person of faith means something. The Apostle Paul talked about fighting the good fight of the faith. We talked today willy-nilly about being King Charles, being the defender of the faith. He's no such thing. Fighting the good fight of the faith, being a defender of the faith, means what I said earlier, that your conscience is conscripted or compelled, to use Paul's language in the New Testament, that the love of Christ compelled or controlled him. It's not a subjective fancy preference. I decide when I'm going to use my conscience to vote against a party. And you are, by definition, being a person of faith means you are not your own. For I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. This life I live in the body, I live by the faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. So to answer James's question, will faith turn the tide for Scottish independence? Possibly, but not in the way that you mean. I think it's significant that Sturgeon was rebuked, but not just by me outside Parliament just before Christmas, but by a bunch of other people in prayer privately, not in public, rebuking for this absolute abhorrence. And then suddenly Sturgeon is unable to string a sentence together when asked, are there any circumstances in which a woman is not a woman? Strong delusion of 2 Thessalonians 2:11, I believe, means that even the best orators in the best countries, as it were, of the world are unable to string a sentence together when they need to. Make no mistake, it doesn't matter who you are, kings, prime ministers, presidents of the world are only in the positions that they're in because of the sovereignty of God. Your heart beating inside your chest right now is because God created myogenic cells to beat on their own, but he providentially sits over all of it, including Nicola Sturgeon's rule and reign, including her ability to string a sentence together. Will faith turn the tide for Scottish independence? Not in that way, but let me make it very clear. Don't underestimate the significance of going outside of Parliament or politicians, wherever it is they have their office, and rebuking antichrist, unbiblical, immoral laws. If more of us did it, less of it would happen.